Welcome to this Americans for Peace Now webinar with UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. You probably noticed that I had to take a breath while giving you the title. It's a long title, Francesca Albanese. Before I hand it over to APN's President and CEO, Hadar Susskind, to introduce today's topic of discussion and our guest. And with that, Hadar, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Ori, and thank you, Francesca, for being with us. Before I hand it over to you, I just want to say to everybody on, I think it will not be a surprise to any of you that the topic of Israeli violation of Palestinian human rights is, of course, a controversial one, as is our guest in some circles, but we are happy to have you with us today because we don't shy away from controversial issues, or even, again, putting aside that word, because I don't think it should be controversial. I think it is important. And I think it's crucial for people who care about Israel and Palestine and the issues between them to understand the reality on the ground and to understand how important that is to seeing the better future that we want to see. So again, without repeating everything that Ori said, I will just note our guest, Francesca Albanese, and I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, was appointed by the United Nations just over a year ago to serve as a special rapporteur on the occupied territories. It's an interesting mandate, I think often misunderstood. And of course, she recently published a very significant report on the violation of Palestinian human rights in the territories that I, for one, want to hear more about. So I'd love, Francesca, I want to hand it over to you and just say, please, tell us, for the folks on the call who maybe don't have as much background, a little bit about the role and the mandate, and then let's dig into the new report.
Thank you very much, Ori and Hadar, for having me with you. And let me also thank all those who are following us. Before I delve into the substance of my mandate, let me address briefly the question of me being controversial, because I would like it not to be personalized. And of course, this is not by you, but in general. And this is very important for me, given the fact that I'm speaking to an American audience. Over the past 20 years, this mandate has been held by legal professionals who have diligently analyzed and exposed the unlawful nature of Israeli occupation and potential international crimes connected with it. Every single expert serving in this mandate has been targeted by personal attacks by substantially individuals and organizations who defend what Israel is doing in the occupied Palestinian territory, which is fundamentally annexing substantive part of it. So these attacks aim to divert the attention from our work, now my work, and undermine, of course, my credibility. So what is this mandate about? It was established 3 decades ago and focuses on investigating Israel's violations of international law. It consists it requires reporting to the United Nations, both the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, twice a year. So I have to write 2 reports per year. While the text of the resolution creating the mandate specifically refers to Israel's violations, I believe that all stakeholders operating in the region, including Palestinian authorities and non-state actors like business enterprises, should be under human rights scrutiny. And this is not to suggest false equivalence, because I think that the scale and intensity of the violations committed by Israel and the Palestinian authorities differ. Because the Palestinian authorities do operate within the confines of Israel's occupation. They are not really an alternative to it. And throughout my mandate, I've made the conscious decision, like other special rapporteurs, to use my voice to raise awareness about the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. There is a widespread lack of knowledge or lack of understanding of the reality on the ground and its legal significance. This necessitates more dialogue and more awareness raising, as I often say, consciousness raising, and engaging constructively with Palestinian and Jewish communities in the occupied Palestinian territory, in Israel, and around the world has been one of my top priorities. This is why events like this are very cherished by me and aligned with with my approach.
Excellent. Thank you. Ori? You're muted. We are having technical difficulties today, folks. Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah, no, that's actually a human error. I forgot to unmute myself. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the report itself. In the 80s and 90s, when Palestinians were released from Israeli prison to their home in the West Bank and Gaza, I remember I remember them being congratulated. It was kind of a little bitter by their friends, saying congratulations on transferring from the small prison to the big prison. And the idea was that the kind of Palestinian dark humor that the occupied territories are a big prison in effect. Your report actually talks about a carceral continuum that extends from prison to the occupied territories at large. And what I wanted to ask you is that a figurative speech, or do you actually mean it? And if so, what do you mean by that?
Yes, I mean it. And I didn't know about this dark joke, but yeah, it doesn't surprise me. So I wrote one report last year to the General Assembly and focused about self-determination in the occupied Palestinian territory. So Gaza Strip, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And this year, I've investigated arbitrary deprivation of liberty. Why so? Why did I decide to focus on this topic? Because it's massive, because of the magnitude of the phenomenon, and I hope we will have the chance to delve into this, because this is the core of the report. And also the gravity of the violations associated to this, which have been documented by Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights organizations over the span of 40 years in a systemic fashion. So what do I mean by carceral continuum? While in prison, I argue that while in prison confinement is the most acute form of deprivation of liberty that is imposed on the Palestinians under occupation, there is a sort of intersecting, interplaying system of an architecture made of physical barriers, bureaucratic barriers, and digital surveillance, which keep the entire Palestinian population confined, contained, and constantly surveilled and controlled. It's like a panopticon. So let me tell you about these layers, because again, you mentioned, is it figurative? To an extent, it could be, because some of these barriers are not evident, but some are very evident. And they have, as Palestinian scholar Nadera Shahub-Kevorkian argues, they have the aesthetics of the incarceration. Think of the checkpoints, the colonies that are built to surround every Palestinian city and village so that they cannot grow, taking, of course, their land. Think of the bypass roads, the segregated roads, which amount in the West Bank only to 400 kilometers, and which means not only arteries that the Palestinians cannot travel on, but also arteries that cut the territory, chop the territories into small pieces that it's very difficult to cross, especially for those like farmers and herders. And think of also the natural parks, which are closed, or the military closed areas that Israel declares basically as it pleases, enclosing entire communities who become ipso facto illegal residents of those areas. To give you an example, Massaferiata, where in the South Hebron Hills, where 1,200 Palestinians who have lived there forever are now being expelled with the blessing of the Israeli Supreme Court, because Israel has created a closed military area for the soldiers to train, to fire. So these are and plus the physical barriers are also those that fragment and segregate Gaza. Gaza is the most extreme, and the enclosure of many communities like Qalqilia surrounded by the wall, or Jerusalem cut off to the Palestinians entirely. On top of this, there are the less physical, the less visible barriers, which I call the bureaucratic barriers. I mean, those who deal with the occupied Palestinian territory know that the life of Palestinian in the entire East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and to an extent also for those in Gaza, are heavily dependent on a complex bureaucratic system controlled by Israeli authorities, made of 100 permits issued by either the military or the civil administration or even the Shin Bet Times, that affect virtually every aspect of Palestinian life, from building a house to changing residence to determining employment options, marriage choices, and even access to medical care or the ability to travel abroad. For everything, Palestinians are dependent on a permit. And the flip side of it is the ban. And it's just a matter of reading Breaking the Silence report, Military Rule, which describes how arbitrary the system becomes, especially for those Palestinians who are identified as a security threat by the Shin Bet. And so with the press of a button, thousands of Palestinians can be banned from having a given permit, which makes their life vulnerable and dependent on the Israeli authorities. They make them life extremely corruptible, but also normally it alienates a sense of dignity, because they depend on everything on the Israeli authorities. And it's very difficult to get these permits. So they tend to then carry out vital activities illegally, according to the Israeli military rule. So this bureaucratic nightmare that Palestinians have to navigate for basically every minutia has a profound effect on them and traps them in a cycle of uncertainty where access to right is very limited. And this is the contextual element that I described at the end of my report, saying not only deprivation of liberty is conducted in such an arbitrary fashion, but also this is the context.
Thank you for, we were there in Israel and in the occupied territories in March, many of us on a trip, including in Mosfet, and saw firsthand the realities of what they're living with there, and the inability to get building permits and so many of the other things that you're mentioning that hit on the day-to-day.
Can I add one small thing that I seem to have forgotten? The third layer, which is as important, as pervasive as the rest, is the digital surveillance. Sorry, it escaped me, but this is what prompted me in the end when I realize how controlled the Palestinians are through CCTVs, cameras, facial recognition, spyware on social media and phone. This is why I argued, because it's very massive. It intersects with the other system, particularly both the physical and the bureaucratic barriers, and creates this sense of constantly surveilled panopticon. I thought it was important.
Yes, it creates a reality of constant surveillance, not just a sense of it. But so that is important. Thank you. I actually want to back up one second just to the logistics of the report, because one of the things that caught my eyes in the introduction, you talk about how you were not able to do all the research on the ground that you wanted in the occupied territories because the Israeli government denied your entry. Was that Israel and the West Bank and Gaza? It seems, needless to say, odd to me that they would have denied that. But can you tell us about that and how it worked, and how did you then do the research behind the paper?
Yeah, it was very hard because I had planned a field visit, and I was given the impression by the Israeli authorities that they would not obstruct it, but they did. And they held my passport for 7 months, letting me think that I would get facilitation of my mission. But however, I've never tried to enter Israel. So I've always said, I'm going to visit the occupied Palestinian territory. And this time it was particularly important because, As I started collecting the first information to do the desk review, I received a lot of information about the Palestinian Authorities' violations, particularly in detention centers in the Jericho area. So the first thing I secured was permission to accept to have unfettered access to all detention centers I wanted in the Palestinian Authority controlled areas. And I got an invitation by the Palestinian Authority, but then nothing happened. So but then I will tell you about this in a moment. So what regarding the denial of entry, this situation of denial of entry is not unique in the sense that of the other 13 country mandate special rapporteurs, some others, like the special rapporteurs on Iran, the special rapporteur on Myanmar, also are denied entry. Think that the special rapporteur on Afghanistan was not denied entry by the Taliban de facto authorities, despite the fact that the special rapporteur writes harrowing reports at the end of his missions. But however, what sets the OPT, the Occupied Palestinian Territory, apart is that the obstructing state, Israel, lacked sovereignty over the occupied territory, but still act as if it does. So applies its migration policies to arbitrarily determining who enters and who doesn't. So going back to what I was saying, despite being denied entry, I've endeavored to address this issue through extensive consultation, including focus groups and virtual tours facilitating by Palestinian organizations, Israeli organizations, some international organizations and individuals. So I've held, for example, town hall meetings in refugee camps, or I've been taken on a virtual tours by Breaking the Silence in Hebron, by Masafer Yatta residents, and one of them was also arrested for 40 minutes while being on the phone with me. It was surreal. But however, I've engaged. Nothing replaces a country visit, of course, because, for example, of the 100 people I interviewed, including families of Palestinians who have been killed by Israel and their bodies were never returned. Mothers and fathers of children who have been detained and abused during detention. It was very difficult to have information from the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, because of course they're scared. And so you see, the fact of not being able to enter has an impact also on the extent I can discharge my mandate vis-a-vis the Palestinian authorities in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. But this is not unique to me. Israel has hampered access to, obstructed access to the Occupied Palestinian Territory to special rapporteurs holding this mandate since 2007. After the last report by John Dugard, who said that certain practices by Israel resembled practices by apartheid South Africa. And since the year later, when Richard Falk came on board as a special rapporteur, he was arrested, detained for 2 days, and then no special rapporteur holding this mandate has ever been allowed in.
Thank you.
What was by the way, were you told why you were denied the entry?
No, but I can tell you it was something interesting. I've never spoken publicly about that. But it was in very interesting timing, because at the time, Israeli authorities were considering, so between the end of November and beginning of December, they were considering my visit, my request. At the same time, there was the article on the Times of Israel reporting that 10 years ago, I had used the term Jewish lobby And this caused a quagmire that then was also reported as one of the causes for preventing me from entering, and also a conference I had given in Gaza, in which apparently I welcome, they said, Palestinian terrorism, which is of course not the case. So there has never been an official justification, but rumors have reached me through Israeli press somewhat.
I think it's important just to pause for a second and underscore the fact that you have just said you do not endorse Palestinian terrorism. That is correct. Okay. I want this to be on the record because I think it's important when accusations are lobbed. Yeah.
No, but did it sound anything different from what I said?
No. I think that, yeah, no. I wanted to go back to the report and ask you about the framing of the report is really interesting, and it's different. It's a different framing. It's looking at the regime of control by Israel of the Palestinians in a different way, a new way. And in the report, you contend that Israel is using, and I'm quoting here, arbitrary deprivation of liberty as a key instrument of Israel's domination and oppression. And what you argue is that Israel treats the entire Palestinian population as a security threat. And again, what I want to ask you is your argument that Israel does not discriminate between those who are involved in violent action against it and those Palestinians who are not?
Yes and no.
Okay.
In the sense that there is, in general, I do argue that Israel does not discriminate between Palestinians who might commit violent acts and others. I further argue that Israel treats virtually all Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory as a security threat, generally presumed guilty, often arrested without charge or trial, and brutally treated while in Israeli custody. And I want to underscore for your audience that particularly this part is fully documented by Israeli organizations like B'Tselem, Physician for Human Rights, Palestinian organizations like Al-Haq and Adamir, and also human rights organizations like Amnesty International, B'Tselem, but also UNICEF when it comes to children. It's not uncommon to see in reports the allegation of the use of torture against children, because of course the bar is different. But you have to think that I have analyzed, it's true that, and I'm happy you noticed this. I've analyzed, sorry, just a second, please. Sorry, there is a bit of noise in the background. I've analyzed all the legal grounds that lead to Palestinians being arrested or detained in the occupied territory. And again, I hope we will have a chance to, or I'm going to mention it in a bit, but what I would like you to realize is that the system of military orders, there are 2,500 military orders that regulate Palestinian life, dating back, based on some regulations dating back to the British mandate that Israel has automatically incorporated into its legal system and criminalize many aspects of Palestinian life in ways, criminalizing conducts that lack criminal relevance or are a mere exercise of civil and political rights, including freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion. Let me give you some example. Crossing residential or rural areas that the military has declared a military zone, a closed area, is a crime, so leads to arrest and detention. So think of the paradox. Israel declares a military zone, so all those living in there cannot build houses, cannot build civilian infrastructure, cannot build school. Everything in that piece of land becomes illegal. Where do these people have to go? But all the more, what's the authority that Israel has to do this, which is absolutely prohibited by international law, because its conduct, as long as it remains the occupying power, needs to be guided by military necessity and proportionality. And again, creating a targeting area where the soldiers can fire is not a legitimate reason to displace 1,200 people. Or think of another example, holding unauthorized meetings of more than 10 people where political ideas are discussed. This includes funerals, vigils, processions, but even weddings can lead to 10 years incarceration, without the permit, without the authorization of the army. So technically anything that is not authorized by the army can be disrupted and lead to arrest and detention. Also, possessing books that are deemed banned or challenging even peacefully the authorities, or working as human rights defenders is considered a hostile activity. Think that 411 organizations, including all major Palestinian parties, charities, and NGOs, are considered hostile. So at the end of it, Palestinians in the occupied territory constantly risk to be imprisoned, and these risks extends to farmers working their land, children going to school across military areas, political leaders exercising their mandates, civil society advocating for human rights. Again, this is the coercive environment. So this is why I say, yes, to an extent, Israel does not discriminate. At the same point, it does discriminate, because in general, those who are caught in a sort of, that are caught as ready to commit an act of violence or an act of resistance, so against the army, are killed. There is this shoot to kill policy, which is again not denounced enough, but it's documented, and it's extremely dangerous and warrants an investigation.
Thank you. It's interesting, we were chatting a little bit, everybody, right? But right before we turned on and got started, one of the things that came up that I think was really interesting in your report also, which is of course focused on, detention and other abuses by Israelis, but also addresses detention of Palestinians in the West Bank by the PA and by the Hamas government in Gaza. So yeah. I'm curious about that. And I mean, even just the baseline question, it's of course different than detention by Israelis. You were talking about the international law. Do those governments, with whatever authorities they have, do they have the authority to do that? Should they not be doing that? What did you have to say about that?
Meaning all authorities, you mean both Israelis and the Palestinian authorities?
I'm talking about the Palestinian, well, no,
the Palestinians.
You're talking about. I'm talking about the Palestinians and the fact that your report also addresses detention by PA and Hamas.
Yes, okay. So first of all, I decided to focus not, as I said in the beginning, not deprivation of liberty. So not any incarceration, but on arbitrary deprivation of liberty. Because there is one fact that is to be pointed out. All authorities, both Israel's and Palestinian authorities, as long as they exercise government power, can arrest and detain, but not as they please. There are rules, and so no one. I mean, anyone arrested anyone can be arrested only on the ground of something valid on a proper law. So only arrest and detention granted in a valid legal basis is in line with international law. It has to respect fundamental guarantees afforded by international law, including fair trial, which includes the access to a fair and impartial trial, appropriate administrative proceedings that respect the presumption of innocence, and the right to legal defense. Also the right during detention to be visited by the legal defense and the legal counsel. I mean, most of it doesn't happen. Sometimes all of it doesn't happen for Palestinians in Israeli custody. Think that 80% of the 5,000 Palestinians currently in Israeli custody are detained outside the occupied Palestinian territory, which is already a violation of international law. It's already a war crime because detained persons from the occupied territory should be detained in the occupied territory and not deported. This is deportation. So, and then once detained, they must not be subject to corporal punishment, must be granted access to medical care, nutrition and hygiene, and under no circumstance they can be tortured or subjected to cruel, degrading or inhumane treatment. This is the basic regulation of detention. Anything different from it is arbitrary. And Israel has, as I was saying earlier, has violated this from the very beginning of the occupation. Nearly 1 million Palestinians have been detained over 56 years. And systematically, from the figures have started to be collected from the first Intifada. So I primarily looked at what Israel has been doing since 1967. And I conclude Israel generally uses its authority arbitrarily against the Palestinians, creating the very conditions that might lead to its insecurity. Think of the treatment of children, normally arrested during night raids, either for stone throwing, which doesn't even constitute an offense technically under Israeli law, but it is an offense leading to either 10 or 20 years in jail for Palestinians, normally kids, regardless of the circumstances. And then children are transferred to interrogation facilities like dangerous criminals, blindfolded and hand-tied in military jeeps in which they spend hours without access to sanitary food or water. And during the interrogation, they're often subjected to torture. And there are studies that conclude that at least half of them spends an average of 12.5 days in solitary confinement in windowless cells, constantly illuminated, causing immense physical and psychological distress, where, as an Israeli lawyer I recently engaged with in a webinar said, the only person they see in this period is the interrogator. This is the only person they interact with who normally abuses them as well. So self-harm and suicide attempts among Palestinian children are not a rare occurrence. So this is what I investigated. And it's very detailed, both the legal counts that can lead Palestinians to be arrested and show you that while Palestinians might commit and have committed acts of violence against Israel, including as Israeli civilians, most of the criminalization of Palestinians occurs in the context of a litany of violations of international law. In this context, the Palestinian Authority or Palestinian authorities in the West Bank and Gaza, that started operating between 20 and 30 years ago, operate within Israel's omnipresent control, they are not an apparatus geared to protect the Palestinians, as exemplified by recent attacks by the Israeli armies or settlers in Hawara, Masafer Yatta, Tormorsie, or Urif. They have been widely reported. Particularly the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, while like the de facto authority in Gaza, enforce its own law in the confined areas they administer. They operate as a sort of an extension of Israel's security. And this is well illustrated by what Palestinians call the revolving door policy, meaning Palestinians being arrested and detained by the Palestinian Authority first, and then as they get out of jail or the Palestinian detention or prison, they get arrested by the Israelis and often interrogated with the same questions and allegedly on the same counts. So there is a very close cooperation between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Israel because of the security arrangements that they stipulated under the Oslo Accords, that puts the Palestinian Authority at odds with the Palestinians themselves. So while, yes, they need to apprehend Palestinians who might pose a danger to the security of Israel, the problem is that Israel confuses its security. So let me be very clear here. The security of its territory within the 67 borders with the security of its annexation plan. Because in fact, 95% of the arrests happen within 1 kilometer from the settlements or 1 kilometer from settlement present. So the settlements are illegal and they cause so much trouble and so much disturbance, and they also led to mass arrest and detention. And this is where the problem that as someone who investigates this matter, I encounter regularly.
So I wanted to follow up on this with a question. I'm going to read you a question that we got from one of the attendees. It's anonymous and it's a little snarky. And then what I'd like to do is sharpen it a little bit after reading your report. So the question says, does Francesca think that there might be a connection between terrorism directly aimed at Israeli civilians and the restrictions imposed by Israel? In other words, isn't the motivation just terrorism, when and international law allows Israel to protect itself against terrorism? Your report, however, shows or tries to show that it's not just that. It's not just anti-terrorism measures taken by Israel. It goes beyond that it's a tool for mass oppression of the entire population. And even you kind of speculate a little bit that there may be further motivation, which is denial of Palestinian self-determination. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that there is a direct, to answer the question, it's not that snarky, to answer the question from the audience. And I think that there is a connection between the policies and practices that Israel furthers in the occupied Palestinian territory and the level of violence. Because there is, again, let's assume, I know that your audience is quite well versed and educated about the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. But also, I'm also aware, having lived in the United States, that sometimes also the language to report facts might be misleading. I see that there is an overuse of the word terrorism that cannot be justified. And again, there are terrorism is violence that is committed for an ideological reason, targeting civilians. In the lack of definition, agreed upon definition of international law, is criminal. So let's assume that this is terrorism. So while Palestinians, as I said, might commit acts of violence, and this might even amount to terrorism, is not that any violent act, meaning any act using force, amount to terrorism, because the category that Israel uses is very broad. The thing that even 6 of the most reputable human rights organizations have been designated as terrorists. And this is not by chance, not by coincidence, is the law that is designed to capture really everything, is any sort of opposition to the Israeli plans represents a threat. And this is what makes Palestinians an incarcerable threat. So why this eventually compounds the denial of the Palestinians' right to self-determination? Because this is what the international community has agreed upon. Israel exists as a state. The Palestinians do not. They agreed that they would have an independent state, so that could be for the Jews, or for all Palestinians, what the state of Israel is for the Jews. This is what the mantra that was recited back in the days. But eventually, this has not happened. On the contrary, what Israel does, and this is something for those interested in reading more about that, this is something that Israel, that I studied and documented in my first report. Israel intentionally prevents the realization of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. How so? By violating the 4 constitutive elements of the right of self-determination. What it is, in essence, the right of self-determination is the right to be free and to exist as a people, and to determine themselves economically, socially, politically over a given territory. Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory does not allow so. So first of all, it violates by violating Palestinian territorial sovereignty by seizing, annexing, fragmenting the occupied Palestinian territory in atomized, shattered landscapes where Palestinians are amassed, and the confinement in Gaza is part and parcel of this fragmentation and segregation, but also transferring most of the, transferring large parts of its own civilian population, Israelis, into the occupied territory. This is a war crime in and of itself, and it has been prohibited since the very first days after the Second World War, because the legislators wanted to prevent what had happened during Nazi fascism with the advancement of German policies of occupying places and emptying and repopulating them. This is why Article 49 has been written the way it was written. Second, sovereignty over natural resources, which are necessary to develop an independent Palestinian economy. And this is violated by Israel extracting and exploiting Palestinian resources, land and water, and whatever pertains to this. And the third element is cultural erasure, is a threat the cultural existence of the Palestinian as a people, which happens by when Israel appropriates, erases, or suppresses symbols of Palestinian identity, a church, a school curriculum, or a flag.
Yeah.
This is sorry.
I was saying the flag is the obvious big one.
But this is not something that came about with Bang of Year. This is something that has been there for many years. And again, my own interpretation of it is that the very display of Palestinian national identity represents a threat to Israel, which wants to expand its territorial borders. And again, this is not my fantasy. This is something that we can extract from the very words of Israeli politicians, and especially these days. And the fourth element is the formation and expression of a Palestinian policy. And I'm glad that there are Israeli scholars who have done an astounding work, particularly Eyal Weizman, in documenting how the beating heart of self-determination, although these are my words, not his, has been violated by the continuous Israeli interference with the formation of political will, repressing political activities, but also killing Palestinian leaders, and not military Palestinians who were in the military ranks, but also intellectuals, teachers, anyone who could be a leading figure. So this is why I say there is a general endeavor aiming to frustrate, to annihilate, to prevent the realization of Palestinian self-determination in the occupied Palestinian territory. And at the same time, any Palestinian who challenges it legally, peacefully, farmers trying to resist the land, or think of the Nilin and Bilin, which are also 2 points of encounter rare encounters, I would say, between the Palestinians and the Israeli civil society, because there are I remember Israeli civil society, they've been joining the protests of Palestinian farmers in Nilin and Bilin for over a decade now. and again, they resist peacefully. And nonetheless, there are many who have been killed, many who have been arrested, including journalists being targeted. I'm not saying anything new if there was an Israeli audience here, they wouldn't be surprised, because this is very well known in Israel, but it's not abroad. I don't know in the US, but surely I often see people not aware of it. So yes, there are, especially now, there is a radicalization of both societies. And what is shocking is that this is my sense, reading the news, reading scholarly articles and opinions. I have the sense that the generation born after the construction of the wall, or those who were born after the Oslo Accords, particularly the youngest, are more prone to radicalization on both sides. And this is, of course, extremely dangerous for both society internally and in terms of mutual coexistence and respect for each other.
That it is. I actually have two questions I want to ask you together, just trying to pay attention to our time here. So the first one, some of what you've talked about is really about individual rights, individual incarceration, and some of it is on the broader communal or national scale. So, one of the questions that comes up is about collective punishment. So home demolitions of, the families of people who have committed acts of violence, or also collective punishment along the lines of, this week there are horrible articles about pouring cement into wells, or, we saw it with the Jenin invasion, also destruction of water and infrastructure. So how does that fit into what you're talking about in the report? And also, let me just ask the other piece, which is admittedly a totally separate question, but I'm just curious, legally, in terms of the international law, you're talking about Israeli political leaders say that they have an expansionist agenda, which is true, right? And you can read any article now from the leadership in the Israeli government, and they will tell you that, which is actually different than not very long ago. Even previous Netanyahu governments, officially, according to them, their policy was in support of a two-state solution, and there's no partner, et cetera. But their on-paper policy, whether anyone believed it or not, was in support of a two-state solution, which means Palestinian statehood. This government has abandoned that policy. And I'm just curious whether that legally impacts any of these actions. If you had a government that was claiming it supported two states versus one that is admitted it has an annexation agenda.
Look, if you look at the debate, you see that many people make a difference between de facto and de jure annexation. I do not agree, because in international law, what I see is a prohibition of acquisition of territory by the use of force. And clearly there is an imbalance between an occupying power and an occupied population. Again, there is no symmetry between the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian authorities, let alone the fragmentation between them, and Israel as a power in the area. So I do see that now Israeli leaders have become more explicit in talking about the unrelinquished ambition to exercise, quote, Jewish self-determination in the entire land of Israel, end of quote. But this is, again, and this is illegal. It's as illegal as it can be, and it's extremely dangerous, because this is happening in other parts of the world. And if we let it happen in Palestine, we will not have a legal argument to really defend and enforce elsewhere. And I'm thinking of East Ukraine, where again, there is an illegal occupation on different grounds, but eventually it's acquisition of land by use of force, which is absolutely prohibited. I mean, removing these, it's going to take us back to the Middle Age of international law. So we really don't want to second that. And so this is the simplest, non-lawery legal argument. At the same time, Hadar, I'm not sure I agree with the real difference between governments, in the sense that even if it was not outspoken policy, the annexation has been gradually pursued, because the moment Israel started to build not just to condone, as it was with the first settlements religious settlements in Hebron, but really help, support, facilitate the acquisition of land by using and abusing the local or changing the local laws, and creating legal conduits to expropriate, confiscate occupied land to build settlements. Now, I mean, this has happened before Smotrich and Ben Gvir. This has happened since the very beginning of the occupation. I mean, since September of that year. And this has happened, including during the years of peace, of so-called peace process. I think there are between 60 and 80 colonies who were built between the intense years of negotiation, and this is documented by B'Tselem. So you see, I think that there has been a cognitive dissonance between words and facts on the ground. And I remember, as a student, many years ago, I read one decision by an Israeli judge, Justice Barak, who was warning against the risk of letting Israeli settlers travel with Israeli law in their backpack, because this would be tantamount to annexation. And again, it has been in the air. It is not something that is happening today. And this is why I say impunity leads to further impunity, and of course violence, because unfortunately this is what's happening.
Thank you. I also want to ask two questions. The first will be, I think, pretty technical, and if you can, I'd appreciate if you answer it briefly. And the other one, I think, is a good tone to end in. So the first one has to do with the question of singling out Israel. Are there other special rapporteurs, and do they work in a similar way, and so on? And the second one is a question. I'll read it out to you. What effect does your report have, or what effect will it have? What happens to your reports? And what do you expect that your reports will do? How do you expect them to impact, I suppose, both Israeli public opinion, general public opinion, and the application of international law? So there you go.
Sorry.
You have 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, I talked too much. I got the message.
No, it's fine.
No, okay. So let me take the question of my reports first. The special rapporteurs. There are 14 country-specific special rapporteurs, and yeah, as I said, they do not monitor easy countries, easy contexts. Most of them are opposed, but again, we are talking of countries which have a serious records of violations. So the peculiarity of the OPT is that it concerns the only state to consider itself, and it's considered unconditionally by many in the West a democracy, and therefore is seen as singled out. I mean, when I discuss with Israelis about the human rights system, they ask me, but why there are so many mechanisms? It's true, there are a number of mechanisms that focus on Israel, but this is a consequence of a political deficit. Because the United Nations body who should resolve this question is the Security Council, which is completely paralyzed when it comes to the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel in general. And so, because of it, other more worldwide representative bodies of the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council then tend to correct this imbalance by trying to pursue accountability. But of course, the problem is not with international law per se, is with the enforcement. My reports. Look, I think that there is that much a report can do. I aim to sensitize about the reality on the ground, and also to infuse a sense of how wrong is often the language we use, because using the wrong language misrepresents the reality and might lead to the wrong analysis and the wrong diagnosis and the wrong cure. So I do hope that it contributes to a better understanding of the reality, but also to demystify certain quite long-standing views. For example, that this mandate is against Israel. Clearly, it's not against the state of Israel. It's not at all against the Israeli people at all. And actually, I'm glad to have been built so many good and solid bridges with many Israelis, including Israelis who do not see eye to eye with me. And but I do think that the only way out is with dialogue and bridging the big cracks that have been created over time between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Thank you, Francesca. I think I cringed a little bit, Ori, no offense, when Ori said, what do you expect the report to do? Because we work in a realm that is ideas and thoughts and policies, right? We're not, building a physical thing someone's going to hold in their hands. But I think that this kind of work and laying out, like you said, the language and explaining in detail a really difficult and for many, many people, very painful reality, right? People who care about Israel, it's hard. You don't want to see it. You don't want to read it. And by the way, we have a huge infrastructure built up, frankly, to have a very particular view of what Israel is and not look at these pieces. And I think for those of us, and I would include, all the folks who are part of our APN movement, everyone who's on here with us today, for those of us who want to see a better future there and one that is peaceful and safe and secure and, vibrant for Israelis and for Palestinians, we have to look at the difficult parts. And it doesn't mean we always agree about every detail or all of those, but we have to look at these parts and we have to address them. So again, I thank you for your efforts to do that. We've got one more minute and I'll just ask you, what would you like to see people take from this report as they go forward?
What was very painful to write, look at the legal grounds that lead a Palestinian to be arrested and detained, because the fact that the Palestinians under Israeli occupation become de facto an incarcerable threat, a security threat. This is no life any individual would like to live, seriously.
Well, that part I think is inarguable. So again, I thank you. I thank you for being with us today. Ori, of course, thank you. And thank you for everyone who joined us. We'll see you all another time. Goodbye.